Good morning, everyone. My name is Robin Churchill, and I'm the Director of the Bureau of Chemical Safety at the Food Directorate of Health Canada, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to thank you all for joining today's webinar, which is being hosted by the Food Forum of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. The Food Forum convenes scientists, administrators, and policymakers from academia, government, industry, and public sectors on an ongoing basis to discuss problems and issues related to food and identify possible approaches to addressing those problems and issues. It does not make recommendations, nor does it offer specific advice. However, it does compile information, develop options, and bring interested parties together. I'd like to thank the Food Forum membership for taking an interest in the topic of microplastics, and I'd like to extend a special thank you to other members of the planning group that were instrumental in the development of this program, as well as Sylvia Rowe, Food Forum Chair, for her guidance throughout. So I'd like to particularly thank Patrizia Baroni, Naomi Fukugawa, Viveka Krayak, Stacy Wiggins, and Sam Zeller. Today's webinar will be recorded and the slides will be posted to the website in the coming weeks, but there will be no published proceedings. The discussion today is meant to provide an introduction to a potentially larger topic for the forum to cover in the future. I hope you enjoy the talks today as much as the organizing team enjoyed setting them up. Microplastics in food and water is an emerging area where there are more questions than answers. Today's talks are intended to provide an introduction to the state of the science, touch on some policy and regulatory approaches, and then consumer perceptions of the risk associated with microplastics. We will hear from 6 presenters today, with time for a brief Q&A following each talk. At the end, we'll have a full Q&A with all of the speakers. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box during and after the presentations, and please identify if your question is directed towards one of the speakers or all of the speakers. Please note that the biosketches of all speakers can be found at the Food Forum website. Our first presenter is Cara Lavender Law. Dr. Law is a research professor of Oceanography at the Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Dr. Law, please start us off.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And thanks especially to Heather Cook and the Food Forum for the invitation to present in this webinar. It's a real pleasure to be here to set the stage for this discussion on what I think is one of the most important avenues of research regarding microplastics as a contaminant in both the environment and in humans. I do have to say that I have no financial disclosure or conflicts of interest to disclose. So with that, I'd like to begin with a historical perspective, posing the question, why are we talking about this topic here and now? And so to do that, I'm showing here a figure of global plastics production shown in blue, starting in 1950, the nominal start of commercial production in units of million metric tons. As you can see by the shape of this curve, there's been very rapid growth in plastics production nearly from the start. And that's for good reason, because this is really an exceptional class of materials upon which all of us are reliant in our daily lives. These materials are flexible in design and in application, and they have properties such as strength, durability, and act as barriers to air and moisture. So for these reasons, growth in plastics production really has been remarkable, having outpaced that of all other bulk materials, including steel, aluminum, and cement. And since 2000, global plastics production has doubled, with accelerated growth predicted to continue on into the coming decades. So since 1950, we've estimated that approximately 8.3 billion metric tons of plastics have been produced. And that number is so huge, I can't give it to you in meaningful numbers of elephants or Empire State Buildings. If you look at the curve below it, that's the red curve, which indicates plastic waste generation over that same time period. And you can see that the curve really has essentially the same shape as the production curve, but it is slightly offset. And that reflects the fact that most plastics that we use are discarded as waste relatively quickly after they're produced, consumed, and disposed of. But some do go into durable goods like computers and car parts that are used for longer periods of time. So if we look at the amount of plastics that have been produced that have become waste, that number is about 70%. And only 9% of that waste has been recycled and about 12% has been incinerated. So the rest has ended up in landfills or the environment. When we think about that 8.3 billion metric tons, about 90% is still in existence, having not been destroyed in any way. Well, if we look at the same timescale from the perspective of plastics in the environment, the first documented evidence of microplastics in wildlife actually occurred in the 1960s. And this was when global plastic production was just 5% of current production levels. So this is just a photograph from this paper showing a seabird carcass with bottle caps and other bits of plastic debris. The first evidence of microplastics, documented evidence of microplastics in the ocean came in the early 1970s in the North Atlantic Ocean and in the North Pacific Ocean. And this is also when plastic debris, larger debris, was documented floating in the North Pacific, things like identifiable objects like sandals, flip-flops. This was when plastics production was just 10% of current production levels. My organization, Sea Education Association, or SEA, first started researching floating microplastics in the 1980s. And in fact, scientist Jude Wilbur published the first account of microplastics collected at SEA in 1987. But given this long history, we really didn't hear much about environmental plastics until the 2000s. And I think that's because in 2003, Charles Moore, who's an avid environmentalist and sailor, wrote an article in Natural History magazine describing his view of the North Pacific Ocean from the deck of his sailing ship as, quote, as far as the eye could see, the site of plastic. And in fact, it was in this article that the term garbage patch was born. So although plastics production has always been on a steep growth trajectory and scientists have been documenting contamination in the marine environment for decades, no one was talking very much about plastic in the ocean until the garbage patch was born. And soon after its birth, the garbage patch developed into a phenomenon. It was described as twice the size of Texas or 3 times the size of France, as having more plastic than plankton, and being a floating island visible from space. So although striking and immensely memorable in this portrayal, this is actually what the garbage patch looks like from space. So it's actually typically quite cloudy over the eastern North Pacific, but when astronauts on the space station were able to get a clear view, this was a photograph from about 250 miles up, mostly blue. If you look at the same view from the deck of the ship, in this case in the North Pacific, but really in the subtropical latitudes of either ocean in the so-called garbage patches, this is what you typically see on a clear, calm day. You mostly just see oceans, maybe some white caps, some clouds. You really see very few ships. You might be lucky enough to spot dolphins or flying fish. But you will see floating debris items drifting by, and these could be as frequently as perhaps 1 item per minute. But they're typically singular items. They might be recognizable, like this boot that's floating upside down, or this 5-gallon bucket. Most often they're not very recognizable. They might be fragments of things, some of which you see sort of in this bin, or just bits of lost fishing gear, or some kind of film. Most of the time you can't identify them, but some of these identifiable objects like the tire and some of the egg crates and other collection of items in this bin were actually collected about 1.5 years after the Japanese earthquake and tsunami delivered millions of tons of debris on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. So this is 1.5 years later in the Eastern Pacific, finding evidence of that event. So to an open ocean sailor, seeing these items hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from land is at first really surprising and kind of a little thrilling. Like, oh my gosh, what is that tire or this children's toy or tea kettle drifting by the ship? And then it's shocking, and then it's ultimately distressing because nobody wants to see trash floating in the middle of the ocean. But the picture changes when you measure what's floating at the sea surface by towing a plankton net through the water for just 30 minutes and sifting through its contents. And this is something that our students at SEA in our program C semester have been doing for decades. So at SEA, we have undergraduates from across the country and also internationally come and study for us for a semester, the second half of which takes place on a tall sailing ship, which is also an oceanographic research vessel. And we tow this plankton net to collect data in support of the student research projects. So if you look at the contents of a net tow in these subtropical gyre regions, you see something that looks like this. And this is a particularly sort of big sample of plastics. But among the plankton, what you see are these small bits of plastic that are pretty easily distinguishable from organic matter because they're brightly colored, irregularly shaped. They have a very hard texture. And it turns out that at the sizes we collect, the human eye and brain does a really good job identifying plastics at these sizes, as confirmed by some laboratory work we've done after the fact. Well, what exactly are microplastics? What is the technical scientific definition? There really is none. It's a small bit of plastic. Why don't we have an exact definition, although we are working towards one? Well, the earliest descriptions of microplastics definitions really reflected the method of observation. So like that plankton net I showed, particles larger than the mesh size, which is about 1/3 of a millimeter, and smaller than about 5 millimeters. That was the first definition of microplastics. But over time, we've been using finer and finer meshes to collect particles. And the smaller the mesh we use, the smaller the particles we can detect, perhaps even down to nanoscales. So microplastics are still typically defined by their size, although definitions do vary widely, and there is a call within the community to try to standardize this definition. Microplastics are also described often by their shape. So in this photograph, I'm showing you the variety of particles that we find, some of which are classified as fragments, typically broken down pieces from larger items. These are often called secondary microplastics. You see bits of what look like line. You can see industrial resin pellets here. So these are those raw material of plastic manufacturing. You might also see films, which are extremely thin, and fibers, which are not actually shown in this image because this was again from a plankton net, and fibers are typically too small to be collected. So shape is used often to try to get at what the potential source of these microplastics might be. So I already mentioned secondary microplastics, which are formed when plastics are exposed to sunlight and oxygen and water, and they become weaker and break down into smaller and smaller pieces. Those resin pellets and other things like cosmetic microbeads are referred to often as primary microplastics because they're manufactured in that size range. Regardless, when you go collect a sample like this, you really can't determine the specific origin of the particles, either the geographic origin or the type of object. I should also mention that other microplastics are shed during use. So that's things like clothing fibers or textile fibers, or particles generated when we drive our cars and that are shed from tires. Microplastics, of course, come in a wide variety of different polymer types, different types of plastics. Number 1 through 7 stamped on our common consumer items are the polymers we're most familiar with. But polymer type, say number 2 HDPE, is not chemically the same in, say, a milk jug as it is in a detergent bottle. And that's because plastic products also contain chemical additives, which are proprietary formulations that give the product its color or enhance properties like those I mentioned earlier, things like flexibility and antimicrobial properties and barrier properties. So in sum, microplastics are a really diverse and complex category of contaminants. And this is further complicated by the fact that these properties change when they're exposed in the environment. So they become smaller, they change their shape, and the chemistry can change. Well, microplastics in the marine environment are the most numerically abundant type of plastic debris. And these photos just illustrate the different compartments in the marine environment in which they've been found. So beaches, floating and distributed deeper in the water column. They've been found in deep sea sediments, frozen into Arctic sea ice. But they're not only in the marine environment, they've also now been found in freshwater, like lakes, streams, and rivers, in the terrestrial environment, including agricultural soils, in the air, in snow, in rain falling on national parks, in drinking water, bottled water, wastewater, stormwater. And it does seem that the smaller the particle, the more abundant and widespread they are, especially microfibers. And that's possibly because they can not only be readily transported in water, but also in the air. So here I'm showing some nice work published this year by Janice Brani. In the first paper, she examined wet and dry deposition in Western US national parks and found that 2 to 6% of particulate aerosols are composed of plastics. And then a follow-up modeling study assessed the likely sources of atmospheric microplastics that were deposited to those Western national parks, but also globally. And so this figure here on the right, bottom right, just demonstrates that deposition is not equal everywhere. And the same is true about microplastics in the ocean. Microplastics are abundant and widespread, but they're not uniform in their concentration. These are data from SEA collected by our plankton nets, by our students using plankton nets in both the Western North Atlantic and the Eastern North Pacific. And I show this just to say that there are regions where we know there are high accumulations. These are the subtropical gyres or the garbage patches, really consisting of floating microplastics. And this can be explained by ocean physics quite nicely. But even within these accumulation zones, you see very high variation. So these black stars are some of the highest concentrations measured. The blue is low, and you can see even, say, 4 hours and 50 kilometers apart, you see quite different concentrations. So particles of this size actually are, the accumulation is nicely described by ocean physics. But if you look at a different type of particle, like those collected by the Adventure Scientists Global Microplastics Initiative, these were collected using 1 liter water samples collected by volunteer scientists across the globe that were then filtered in a lab using a filter size of 0.45 microns. So in this case, the particles that were collected, the smallest particles that could be collected were about 750 times smaller than those collected in the plankton net, like I showed in the previous slide. And what you see is the pattern of distribution and the pattern of distribution is quite different. So you can see that there again is large variability, samples that contain no microplastic, others that contain 1 or 2 particles per liter, and then the highest 500 particles per liter. But the point I want to make here really is that although microplastics are globally distributed, they're not everywhere in the same amounts. And it's really important when you look at maps like this to understand, first of all, how the data were collected. How we look matters, whether that's from space, the deck of the ship, using a plankton net, or filtering and using a microscope. And that we need to keep in mind exactly what we're looking at. Okay, I'm briefly going to run through this because this is really the bulk of the rest of the session today, I think. Why do we care about microplastics? We know that marine life, from large marine mammals down to fish, invertebrates, and even plankton consume microplastics or plastic debris in general. And now more than 700 species have documented ingestion of plastics. And the concern is about, of course, physical damage and the lack of nutritive value of plastics, but also there's concern about the chemicals associated with these materials and that they might transfer into animal tissue and cause harm. So I'd just like to point out a study by Chelsea Rockman's group that critically evaluated the evidence of impacts from the scientific literature for plastic debris ranging in size from nanometers to kilometers. So you see that on the bottom of the scale here, nanometers on the left, kilometers on the right. So microplastics fall into this left side of both of these plots. And what the shading indicates is effects that were tested in individual studies according to debris size and the level of biological organization that was affected. And what they did was they assembled all of this information, found that 421 different biological effects at a different level and a different particle size were tested. And in the case of microplastics, 47% of those studies found evidence of an effect, and 53% found no evidence of effect or found no effect. So the point I'd like to make is that there is evidence of impacts due to microplastics, but we can't make sweeping generalizations about the risk or harm to animals or ecosystems at this point. And that really reflects the complexity of microplastics. So this is concerning, but of course the reason we're here is that now the concern has extended to human health. And we have plenty of evidence now that microplastics are contaminating items that we consume. Are they actually in our bodies? Recent medical studies indicate yes, there is exposure and transmission in the human body, but are they causing harm? We can't yet answer this question, but I think this is really the core of what we'll be discussing as we continue on today. I'm going to skip this because I'm getting a little bit close to the end and just finish with a word on environmental nanoplastics. So there is evidence of, well, I should back up and say, we think about sort of these large plastic items, which are the source of most microplastics. And as I said, when they're exposed to sunlight and the environment, they do weather and weaken and break it down into these microplastics, definitely down to microns in size, which we have now collected in the environment. But there are some laboratory studies that indicate that these particles can get down to nanoscales. And that's from a laboratory study that found particles smaller than 2 microns, as well as colloidal material collected from seawater. But we don't yet have robust methods to directly detect and characterize these in complex environmental samples. I do think this is an area that requires quite a lot of attention because I think the risks and the concern about nanoplastics exceed even that of microplastics. So with that, I will just leave this with an acknowledgement and thank my many colleagues and collaborators. And I will welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Law. And I don't see any questions from the audience yet. However, I did have one for you. In your slide on the effects that they were looking for with the microplastics, what were some of the types of effects that they were looking at?
Yeah, so this is actually not my field of expertise, but I will say that the effects really ranged from effects on the organism, including things like reproductive effects, growth, all the way down to sort of the cellular level impacts. And so things like oxidative stress on cells. So you'd have to dive into the individual studies to know, what level was being targeted in the specific study.
Thank you very much. All right, so we have two questions in here, which is probably all we have time for. The first is from Samuel. What is the problem with the buildup of plastics in seas and oceans? Why not think about the possibility to resolve the problem of rising quantities of the plastic in the seas and other water resources via the increasing of recycling and reuse of plastic?
Oh, that's a great question, and we can talk for a long time about that. Actually, the way I wanted to frame this talk was to really illustrate that concern began in the ocean, I think, and that's because of the garbage patch and because of, people seeing images of seabirds with bellies full of plastic and entangled marine mammals. But I fully agree that as we've learned more about this problem, we move further and further upstream and to land. And in fact, I was fortunate to be on a committee at the National Academies that just released a report on U.S. contributions of U.S. plastic waste, specifically to the ocean, but we considered that more broadly. And you'll look at the sort of proposed interventions, and they really do span plastic production all the way to input to the ocean.
All right, and the second question actually I think leads into some of our other talks today, but do regulatory agencies need to start thinking about the regulation of microplastics in food animals as we have for residual antibiotic levels in food animals?
So that's a great question, and I think a very relevant one, and I am probably not the best person to address it. But I will say on the federal agency side, again, just pointing to that National Academies report, the prime recommendation we made was for a national strategy to address plastic waste at all scales from both a research and a policy perspective.
Thank you. Oh, and one more. Is there data on microplastic waste from food packaging?
I'm not sure how to interpret that. So I can guarantee the data that has been collected in the environment, a lot of it probably originates with food packaging, although we can't always trace a direct line to a specific product. In terms of looking at contamination in an animal or in a human, I can't answer. I don't think we know.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Law. And we will see you again when the panelist time comes out.